Hello, everyone, and to this webinar with the Green EFA Group in the European Parliament. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm here with three great MEPs from our group, Lena Schilling, Eickhout, and Sara, Mathieu, who are all in Belém for the COP30 climate conference 2 weeks ago, and that's what we're going to get into over the next half an hour or so. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened at COP, and then maybe look more at the future over the next while. So, Lena, before you went, and you're a new MEP, and you've been to I think it's your second COP. What were the expectations first going into COP30?
There are very different kind of things you expect from a climate conference, because first we were 10 years after the Paris Agreement. So I think in general it would have been nice if it would have been the COP where you are like, okay, after 10 years of Paris, we are delivering on the promises the leaders of the world have made. This did not happen, spoiler. I think what we're expected, and I think that's also a bit the sad part after the US stepping out of the Paris Agreement, and the general geopolitical situation was not too much. So already going to Brazil was a bit of a mixed feeling, because on the one side, it's the first COP after years where there is civil society, where there was a protest before the second week started on Saturday, with 50,000 people being on the street, being loud, being vocal, saying, hey, we are still caring. And this 10 years after Paris actually matters. And then knowing this will maybe not be the most successful COP, and that was also what we have seen.
So, Bas, what did we get if we didn't get a successful COP in the end?
We got a very small step forward, but to be very honest, it was a disappointing outcome. As Lena said, the expectations were already not so high when we started, although this should have been the COP where all the plans for 2035 would be presented by all the countries in the world, apart from the US. But already in the run-up to the COP, a lot of countries were very late with their national plans, including Europe itself. I mean, Europe only concluded its 2040 targets when Ursula von der Leyen was already in the airplane to Belém. So the entire idea of the Paris Agreement to have momentum before, so that countries really beef up their plans because of the others, didn't work out. And that's also certainly Europe to blame for. But then at the COP itself, it was very difficult to get to some specific discussions. And then Lula suddenly raised the ambitions the week before. So everyone was a bit like, okay, maybe there's still something coming out. And that was, of course, the famous roadmap to phase out fossils. But that, in the end, was killed again by Saudi Arabia, India, China. So even that didn't end up in the negotiations. And I think what was most painful was that Europe, in these negotiations, was pretty much standing alone, partly because we were late ourselves, or we were late in also acknowledging that we need to move on financing adaptation. But of course, also partly because in the world, the appetite for more ambition is just very low. So yeah, we took a little step. You can say we now agree to a process where next year we're going to discuss ambition again. But that's a bit the level where we are. I mean, the world is heating up way too much, and we are agreeing on a process for next year. That's not a success.
And Sarah, just sticking to the European angle, with the US not there, did Europe play a key role, or was it kind of sidelined as well, given the geopolitical situation from your point of view?
I mean, I think even though I agree that this is a disappointment, I think we still need to say at least there is a multilateral agreement. And of course, you know, everyone was a bit afraid of that with Trump backing out of Paris and boycotting the whole thing. Like, is this actually going to amount to anything? I agree that it's not enough, but at least there is this multilateral agreement. At least there are the certain steps that Bas was referring to. Also intermediate, where there is going to be this conference on the fossil fuel phase out and some of the things that we need to do to bridge the gap. I think it really didn't help that we took such a long time discussing amongst ourselves in Europe to come up with our own climate ambition, and we were so focused on ourselves that we were not focused on the rest of the world enough. And that really showed while we were doing those negotiations. I mean, for instance, we had a sit-down European delegation together with the Chinese, where, I mean, this would have been maybe one of those power players. If we would have worked hard together, we would have been able to accomplish more than what was on the table. But indeed, right now, Europe was standing alone. We were still the ones pushing for it the most. And I do think it's important to emphasize that, because sometimes I think a lot of people feel, rightfully so, I would say, a bit disappointed on what is happening at the European level right now when it comes to climate and environment. But at least at the COP, we were still the ones pushing forward the agenda. It's only, you know, the reality check that if it's just us, it's not going to fly. So already stepping a bit into the discussion of what we should have done, but perhaps also what can we do in the future, I think we need to invest a hell of a lot more in climate diplomacy, making sure that it's not just Europe pushing there for the ambition, because otherwise, you know, we are not going to succeed.
Lena, do you think we're to follow up on Sara's point, do you think we're spending too much time talking and thinking about ourselves, navel-gazing about Europe, and not enough on climate diplomacy?
I think the question is how we discuss among ourselves and what the progress is. And you already mentioned it. I mean, if we would have delivered our NDC, so our climate target, on time, this would have been a completely different sign to the world. But we missed, one deadline was moved, we missed the second deadline, and then we were still saying, yeah, but we want to be the leaders and go in negotiations where we don't have prepared the ground with the Chinese, as you mentioned. I think one of the main takeaways was also like, this climate diplomacy needs to happen earlier, but then we also need to deliver our own homework. And as long as we are not doing that, what is our ground on negotiations? Why should anybody trust us? And I think Europe should be trusted, but therefore we also need to speed up our processes, deliver on deadlines, but also this whole 2040 target. And what happened there with the delays, with this power play, then moving it to the UCO, then moving it away, like this whole power play that happened there before, instead of just taking our responsibility, delivering on a climate target on time, this was not helpful at all. Even if we could have, yeah, you're laughing because it's really
it's a bit
like
of an understatement.
Yeah, no, but I'm trying to stay in the positive mood Sara put up and saying, yeah, okay, but hey, there is still multilateralism. But in the end, it's the question, is Europe delivering or not? And we also have to ask ourselves that in the house.
For those who aren't following the UCOs and the different
yeah,
things,
closely enough, huh?
why are we dragging our heels, Bas? What's happening at European level now that
well, you should ask the Conservatives this question, because the same Conservatives who in 2020 declared climate emergency, those same politicians are now saying that we should put up a brake and that this is killing our competitiveness. Well, I think what is killing our competitiveness is creating this unclarity. So not only is it not helpful for the international negotiations, it's also not helping our economy. Investors do not know where Europe is going. So America is messing things up with Trump. China is meanwhile just going ahead with investing in innovation. But of course, on the world stage, China is also happy if the world is not moving too fast. So you don't expect China to push that now. So Europe is there in the middle, and I think everyone is watching a bit Europe. So on your question, are we being watched? Yes, we are. But we're not ready yet to take this leader role that we should be taking, and which is not only good for the international climate negotiations, but also for our own economy. Because if we want to be competitive as a European continent, we will not do that by deregulate ourselves. That's a match we will always lose of the Americans. And we will not win with the Chinese if we're not going to invest. So we need to steam ahead. And every time all these discussions about all our legislation, should that be reopened or not, it's creating navel-gazing at the European level, but also killing our competitiveness at the global setting. So that is the problem, and don't ask us. We want to move ahead. It's the Conservatives that are killing our industry now.
We also have some questions coming in from the audience, so I'll try to flag them as well. We have one, so we've spoken a little bit about Europe now and also China. We have a question from Mohammed, and Sara, you might take that. Was the absence of the US at COP30 significant? Did it make any difference? Also with the Trump administration, was it a good thing or a bad thing that he wasn't there?
I mean, I have a bit of mixed feelings, to be honest, because, of course, right now, with all the power play, the blackmail, everything that is going on from the Trump side, you don't want to say that we are missing the Americans. But if we're very honest, and this is of course not the Trump administration, but the diplomatic efforts and talents that are, I think, still available in the US, they are somewhere. Maybe they got by Trump, I don't know. But yes, I think it's fair to say that these talents were missed, especially when it's crunch time, when really it sometimes is just down to the nitty-gritty of finding the right phrase to get everyone on board. I think this was like a shared sentiment, and also one of the reasons why we were standing quite alone as Europe. Now, would it have been better if they were there? Absolutely not. I think that we've seen in other multilateral negotiations when it comes to maritime, when it comes to plastics, for instance, that what Trump is really trying to do is sabotage the whole thing. So if he would have been there, I'm quite certain we wouldn't have come to any kind of agreement, which of course would have been a lot worse. So very mixed. On the one hand, yes, we're missing a bit this big power block and the diplomatic talents that used to be there. But on the other hand, I'm also very glad that Trump can't say, oh, I managed to screw everything up here, and now there is zero commitment anymore in the world when it comes to climate policy.
Do you see them coming back to the table, the US, Bas? Your tea leaves?
Well, we've seen that under Biden, they came back again, right? So I think what is also important is that there's a lot of states that are still delivering on climate policies, right? So I think Washington will always be very complicated because the topic of climate change is totally polarized. But at the same time, the investments in renewables are still ongoing in the US, and quite some states are also delivering on climate policies. Now there's more and more battle between Washington, D.C. and the states, what they can do. But also there were Americans present at the COP in the we're still in kind of phrase. So I think the Americans, they do know that they need to play a role, but yeah, under this administration, they will not be. So let's hope the Americans will take a wise decision when they vote for a new president in 3 years' time.
Okay, we have a question from Ursula in Belgium. I wonder who that is.
Is she living in the Belém building?
Is she infiltrating our webinar now? That's
Ursula asks, I'll give this to Lena, is the creation of a roadmap for moving away from fossil fuels outside of the official UNCCC negotiation process a good sign that some countries want to act faster, or is it a bad sign that it's so divided that the entire negotiation process is falling apart?
It's definitely not a good sign. I think that the first thing is this roadmap, also as Bas said, we were all going or looking to Brazil with what will happen there. And then it was a bit Lula saying we will have this roadmap on the phase out of fossil fuels. And it's not the first time. It was promised in COPs before already. So it was just the implementing of what was promised actually. And then we were not able to find an agreement under the countries that already committed to that. And now it's like just an initiative and we see and the process will happen. That's of course terrible, because phasing out of fossil fuels is the thing we need to do to cut our emissions and to meet our promises. So it is not just, I think it's not just a bad sign, it's really failing on the promises they have made. And there we need to be also strong and say, coming then up with initiatives in the last second. Also, that was a bit like this coming up in the last second with any kind of initiative to not let it fail completely. We should not let them get away with it. But what do you think? I think you were there till the last minute and were...
Also because the word fossil fuel didn't appear in any final text in the end.
It was a big reference.
Yeah. The Europeans fought hard to have a reference to the United Arab Emirates consensus, which in that consensus you had the phase out of the phase out of fossil fuels. So it's a very indirect reference. No, I think what the Brazilians, as I said, Lula was making it a too big promise. Then he got pushed back by his BRICS friends, so Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, China. And this was a bit of a face-saving exercise that then the president of the COP, so Brazil itself, said, but I will work on it. Yeah, well, sorry, that's indeed a bit of a face-saving exercise. But if we're going, I mean, the COPs are already complicated enough. If we are now getting initiatives on the side of COPs, and the strength of the COP is, of course, that you are pushing all the countries. It's perfectly fine that countries take their own initiatives, but we don't need a COP process for countries doing things. the COPs are there in order to put pressure on all the countries. If we are now getting too many presidential initiatives on the side of a COP, I think then we are creating more unclarity, and it's not helping to make the COPs more fruitful. So I think in the end, I also wonder how much will come out of this, to be very honest. I think it was a bit of a face-saving exercise for the Brazilians. I'm a bit skeptical on what really will come out of it. So I think it's now up to Europe to bring this topic back on the agenda of the COP. But don't do that in November. You need to start in January.
Yeah. But we'll move on to the future. But just on that lobbyist fossil industry point, there was a lot of debate in advance and during around the power of the fossil fuel lobbies, the presence of the fossil fuel lobbies. When you were there, Sara, was it obvious, firstly? And secondly, what should be done about the whole lobbyist question that seems to be drowning COPs every year?
Was it obvious? It's not as simple, of course, as walking around on the COP and people have I'm a fossil fuel lobbyist stamped on their
Although
foreheads.
some you see walking, you think that's one.
You can guess, perhaps. So no, I wouldn't say that it was that obvious, but of course we had heard that this was the case, and we also felt it. Is that just because there are so many fossil fuel lobbyists, or is this really also due to the oil states, Saudi Arabia really doing a lot of pushback? I mean, we also don't have to oversell the importance of the fact of these guys and girls being there, right? I think on the other hand, it's a tricky subject because, well, if you say we don't want lobbyists, that also means civil society. That also means people lobbying for indigenous rights, for the protection of the rainforest, for actually progressing our climate agenda. So I wouldn't oversell the importance of them being there, but I do think symbolically, it's a very nasty thing. I do have to counteract that a bit in the sense what you could see in the COP walking around there were a lot of indigenous people. And this was actually quite nice. It was also really visible, I think, in the climate march where, I mean, so many different communities were present there. And I do think that that is very important, even if they are, I think, still not enough on the negotiating table, to put it that way, and too much still in the fringe meetings and, in the climate march. I do think that that is something we need to support and make sure that they have their seat on the table as well.
And Lena, you met some indigenous leaders in the run-up. How was that experience for you?
I will come to that. I think also one point I want to make about fossil lobbyists. I think the worst fossil lobbyists are some heads of the states, to make it clear. So it's not just people running around. If you look at Saudi Arabia or other countries that are the fossil lobbyists, but that are the heads of states. So I think that's one of the main problems, that they're not just running around, they're actually taking decisions and boycotting our processes or destroying it even. So I think that is really a main part. And then what Sara was saying also on the indigenous people, and I think there was also why do you organize a climate conference that was criticized a lot for where it took place in Belém, in a place where it's really not easy to get there and so on, because you want indigenous people to be there. And I met the Kayapo and some other indigenous groups that were actually telling about how they are protecting the forests for such a long time, how their connection to the forests, to the rivers is what it actually means if you have fossil influence or deforestation in their areas, what that means for whole communities, how they get threatened. And I think the one thing Lula also promised was to get them a seat at the negotiation table. And that did not really happen. It was more of a show where they were invited. And what happened then is 10 areas got demarcated, which is good, but it's 10 areas out of so many. So it was also a bit of a show act. And there, I think also Brazil should have been a bit more wise in how to actually organize that they have more room in the actual, not just negotiations, but in the actual rooms, because a lot of them were just in front of the rooms and then tried to enter it at one point, as I think some of the people have seen. So I think there is some tension still, but in the end, and I think that's the main point we have to also take into account in our work, when we talk about deforestation, especially when it's about tropical rainforests, this is about people living there. This is about people defending these places. And if we talk about funds, and that's maybe one of the last points of the negotiations, also the people that defend the forests need the money to do that. And we have to integrate this thinking of who are actually the people that profit from funds that are allocated to forests, just as an example.
Bas, after all of the shortcomings now from Brazil, what's next? What can we do? Where do we go from here when it comes to COP, but also climate action more generally?
Bas, give us the solutions.
Yeah, that's a small question, Simon.
Optimism.
Yeah. Should I? Well, I think we need to look a bit at how these COPs are functioning. So if you just look at how they developed since we have the Paris Agreement, right? It's now 10 years after Paris. You could say we needed the first 5 years to really implement Paris and decide on all the rules. Plus you saw a momentum also, just on a positive note, no one talked about climate neutrality before the Paris Agreement. And in those 5 years, suddenly, all the countries said, okay, we need to be climate neutral with different dates to it. And yes, one country is more serious than the other. I mean, Russia also promised climate neutrality. As far as I know, Russia is not really on track for that. But at least you see that climate neutrality is now what countries are thinking of. And then let's see how they get there. So the first 5 years of Paris implementation were successful. And you can also see that in the projections. Temperature increase was expected to be around 4 degrees before we had Paris. We are at the level around 2.5 now, if all these plans are being implemented, right? That's still a big if. What you see, however, the last 5 years is there's not so much progress anymore. We are getting a bit stuck on a lot of different topics. And I think the COPs are being taken over not only by fossil lobbyists, but also by legal experts, and throw them a bone and they will talk about legal text for decades. But that's not what the world needs anymore. So I would say, I think we need to make the COP more political, so less broader, where you have all the different topics. I mean, all these topics can still be discussed, but you don't need the political leaders to come to a place to discuss a certain Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. But what you do need the leaders for is political promises on what are you going to do for 2035? And we're not doing enough as a world. So what's your contribution in order to close that gap? And on financing, how do we make sure that those countries that are really suffering from it are sincerely being helped? Those are highly political discussions. You don't need 20 lawyers for that. You need political leaders for that. So I think a COP can be smaller, can be sharper, can be shorter. And then you have to put the real political issues on the table. And then in Bonn, you have the UN Secretariat on Climate, and there they can discuss all the nitty-gritty that needs to be discussed. But I think the COPs themselves need to be more politicized again, because otherwise they're all hiding behind very technical terms. But meanwhile, we know what's happening. It's Saudi Arabia inside those rooms blocking everything. Expose that. Let that the world see.
I'll go to another question now from Ava in Germany, and this is for you, Sara. How can we as European citizens, but also we as climate and biodiversity scientists and science communicators, best support the way forward now?
Well, I mean, I think it's safe to say, and we've all sort of felt that right now climate is not the top priority in the political sphere, and we of course regret that very much. And I think we as Greens are still pushing it forward, because this is such a hugely important thing for the survival of our planet, but also for the economics, as Bas has said. I just think it's not going to be sufficient that us in the European Parliament or in national parliaments, or basically just politicians, are pushing this agenda forward. Because if you look backwards, how did we actually, for instance, in Europe, come to such an important package of climate and environmental legislation called the Green Deal? Because there were mass protests on the street, because young people were saying this is about our future and we are taking this into our own hands. And so I think what we need is to rally up again, together with civil society, together with our youth that is fighting for their future, to make sure that we strengthen each other. And well, climate policy and attention for climate is often a very cyclical thing, but that's too easy of an answer. We need to make sure that it's on top of the agenda again, but we can't do that alone. And that's really where people like the person asking that question come in. We are going to need everyone on board, making sure that people are on the streets again, that they are making op-eds, that they are trying to influence, but also, for instance, I would say within companies are pushing for the greening of our industry, for a green transition, within the trade unions, making sure that they are also backing up our climate agenda. So this is really about us joining forces with everyone in society, putting this higher on the political agenda again, because if we don't, then we stand into the status quo of deregulation, simplification, and let's face it, it's not going to save the planet, and it's also not going to save our economy.
Lena, you've all been very involved in climate protests, street to parliament over the years. For the youth movement now, do you see them getting their groove back after maybe the green wave a few years ago?
I think a lot of them are still active.
Do young people still say getting their groove back? Is that a thing that people say?
No.
I think that's from the 70s.
Okay. I was decently
Boomer.
smiling about it. The groove. Where's the groove of the climate movement? I love that. I think we're not grooving, but we are still fighting. And I think that's like maybe the main element. Also, what we saw in Brazil. If you have 50,000 people on the streets that are mostly young from all across the world, we are often looking much just to Europe and say, yeah, but where are the young people? First, they're still going on the streets. Some of them became politicians. Some of them are in journalism. So we are still here. And I think the main part is, and that's also a bit the answer to one of the questions, is I think we're just not allowed to lose hope. That is the main thing. And that's also what I always want to tell young people. This is extremely frustrating. 10 years after Paris, sitting here discussing that this was not good enough and that we need to change the COP process. All of this is very technical and it's needed. But what we really need is not to lose hope, to find ways to encourage each other, because there is just no other way. If we give up, we lost. And there is a world to win out there. But then we really also need to fight through phases where the far right is rising, where the conservatives are failing us, are blocking us, are destroying our future, but we can fight back. And I think that's also the motion a lot of young people have. And also, if I look just an example into Germany, how pissed people are with what Friedrich Merz is doing. There are people on the streets, and we are not letting them get away with the shit they are doing.
That actually is a very good segue to my last question for both of you, but because you've answered it, maybe I give it to Bas and give it to Sara. Thinking back to Paris 10 years ago, where we did agree climate neutrality by 2050, what gives you hope now after 10 years of Paris? Maybe we start with Bas.
I think really if we want, change is happening, and that is really important. And in that sense, also the world has changed dramatically since 2015, right? If you look at how renewables have increased across the globe, and also really on a competitive level, right? I mean, at this stage, it's only economic wisdom to invest in renewables. And fossils are becoming more and more expensive. And this is also why the fossil lobbyists are active, because they also feel that. And I mean, all the prognosis of the International Energy Agency were outbeaten. So every time when they had a projection on how solar would be developing, you see the actual development, it's outbeating any prognosis. So in that sense, the developments are going faster than people realize. I think Europe is having its biggest problem now, is if we think that indeed on climate we have to take a pause because whatever reason, I still don't understand what Friedrich Merz is trying to say there. You are killing our industry. The German car industry, if they will settle down now and take a pause, the Chinese car market will take over. Yeah. And in 20 years' time, we are just only importing Chinese cars. The only way for jobs in Europe, in the German car industry, is by innovating now and not slowing down. Everyone knows that, apart from some politicians. They are now maybe in leading the country, but I think indeed this we should be fighting back. And if you see that the moment we are pushing into a certain direction, the innovation is taking off and the world is changing. So there indeed, don't give up hope because you are not allowed to, but also because it's just a fact that the world is changing and Europe has the chance to be part of it or to let it happen outside, and then we are only importing it. And it's our duty to make it also happen in Europe, and it can happen.
Sara, what gives you hope?
Well, very much in the same line, actually, which shouldn't be a surprise because, well, the two of us are working a lot on greening our industries. I mean, it's completely insane to think that you are going to save the economy of the future by relying on the recipes of the past, especially, and you can see that in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. The fastest growing sectors are clean tech. So this is about renewables, this is about batteries, this is about windmills, etc. It's only getting easier, it's only getting cheaper. I think 10 years ago, we couldn't have imagined it would go with this kind of speed. So that gives me hope because you can see it in reality. You can also see it when you're talking to CEOs of a lot of businesses, sadly not all of them, actually seeing the potential of it. But we also need to be careful, of course, that we're not only looking at Europe when it comes to that. And that links again into the climate financing, but it's not just about money. It's also about, for instance, technological transfer, making sure that we share what we now have as a capital on innovation and green technology with the rest of the world, and that we support them. Because I think that that's a huge win-win. And right now, that is not happening enough. So partially, it's the economy, stupid, that is really going to help us, that is actually going to make sure that even though we're not happy with the state of, I would say, the climate ambition that came out of the COP, for instance, looking at China, very often they under-promise, but they over-deliver. So this is for me also one of those things where I see we need to be hopeful. And I still really believe in the power of people and the power of conviction and the power of fighting for what you believe in. So for me, that's enough reasons to still be hopeful and optimistic.
Okay, the fight is not over, and it's always nice to end on a hopeful note. So a big thank you to Lena and to Bas and to Sara for being here. That's all we have time for today. You can subscribe to hear more about these events on our website, greens.efa.eu, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining. Thanks very much.